Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and we will be learning today, Mitzvah Hashem, excuse me, Daf Lamed Daled Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchas Tefillin, and we pick up on Lamed Daled Amid Aleph, very first line of the Amid, Siman Chav Hey Sif Yud. So we learned in yesterday's share that you're not allowed to be mafsik between the putting on of the Shel Yad and the putting on of the Shel Rosh. Our minig, we paskin according to the Ramah, except for Svardim. We paskin like the Ramah, the Svardim paskin like the Mechaber. We make two brachas when we put on tefillin. We make a bracha of Al Sher Kedushanim and Mitzvahs of Tzivanu Lahanyach tefillin before we put on the Shel Yad, and then we make a bracha Al Mitzvahs tefillin before we put on the Shel Rosh. Svardim make one bracha, they paskin like the Mechaber, they make a bracha lahanyach tefillin before they put on the Shel Yad, and that's the only bracha that they make. Now, the problem is, if you're mafsik between putting on the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, you create a problem both according to the Mechaber and according to the Ramah. According to the Mechaber, it's very simple to understand. According to the Mechaber, you're supposed to make one bracha, lahanyach tefillin, and that bracha covers both the putting on of the Shel Yad and the putting on of the Shel Rosh. If you're mafsik between putting on the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, now you are mafsik between the bracha of lahanyach tefillin and the asiyas hamitzvah, the completion of performing the mitzvah when you put on the Shel Rosh. Now, according to the Mechaber, you have to make a second bracha. You would have to make al mitzvahs tefillin before you put on the Shel Rosh. But by being mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, what you did was you were matzrich a bracha she'ena tzricha. According to the Mechaber, you were only supposed to make one bracha. You really were only supposed to make a lahanyach tefillin. The only reason you're making a bracha now, al mitzvahs tefillin, before putting on the Shel Rosh, is because you were mafsik. So you're being matzrich a bracha she'ena tzricha, something that you're not allowed to do. According to our minig, according to the Ramah, you also have a problem, because like we learned yesterday in the Mishnah Berurah, even according to the Ramah, where we make one bracha of lahanyach tefillin before we put on the Shel Yad, and another bracha of al mitzvahs tefillin before we put on the Shel Rosh, the bracha of lahanyach tefillin goes on both the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. The way the Mishnah Berurah explained yesterday, the minhag of the Ramah, we make a bracha of lahanyach tefillin that goes on the putting on of both the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. And then, before we complete the mitzvah with putting on the Shel Rosh, we make a bracha of al mitzvahs tefillin. Now, according to the Ramah, if you are mafsik between putting on the Shel Yad and putting on the Shel Rosh, now the lahaniach that you made before you put on the Shel Yad can't go on the Shel Rosh because you are mafsik. So now you have to make a new lahaniach. And you have to make, before you put on the Shel Rosh, you have to make a lahaniach and an al mitzvahs tefillin. And again, you're being matzrich a bracha she'ena tzricha. Now we pick up on the top line of Lamed Daled Amid Aleph, Siman Chav Hey Sif Yud. Continuing on this same topic, says the Mechaber, Im sach l'tzarich tefillin. Let's say you're mafsik with dibur, you speak between putting on the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, but you do it with something that is l'tzarich tefillin, right? Maybe you put on your Shel Yad and you realize that there's something wrong with the kesher, and you ask the fellow standing next to you, excuse me, do you know how to fix this? So now you're being mafsik, but you're being mafsik l'tzarich tefillin, even though you're speaking, but that dibur is l'tzarich tefillin. In that case, says the Mechaber, einoi chayzer umavarech, then you are not required to go repeat the bracha. So again, according to the Mechaber, this means you made a lahanyach tefillin, now you are mafsik b'dibur between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. Normally, according to the Mechaber, you would now have to make it al mitzvahs tefillin before you put on the Shel Rosh. Says the Mechaber, if the dibur was l'tzarich tefillin, you do not have to make it al mitzvahs tefillin. The original bracha of lahanyach tefillin that you made before you put on the Shel Yad will still cover the Shel Rosh, because your hefsek does not constitute a hefsek. You spoke, but you spoke l'tzarich tefillin, that does not constitute a hefsek. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kat Lamed Gimel im sach, va'afilu im sach bein birchas lahaniach ubein hanachas hatefillin Shel Yad gam kein dina hachi. The Mishnah Berurah tells us a very interesting chiddush. The Mishnah Berurah says, what did the Mechaber say? The Mechaber's case is you are mafsik when between the putting on of the Shel Yad and the putting on of the Shel Rosh. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you spoke litzarich tefillin, then even if you spoke between when you made the bracha and you put on the Shel Yad, so you are mafsik between the bracha and any part of the Asiyas HaMitzvah. In the Mechaber's case, you made the bracha of Lahaniach Tefillin, and then at least you put on the Shel Yad, and now you are mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. The Mishnah Berurah is telling us an even bigger chiddush. Let's say you are mafsik between making the bracha and any part of the Kiyam HaMitzvah. You made the bracha, and then you never put the Shel Yad on. Instead, first you are mafsik b'dibur, but the dibur was l'tzarech tefillin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the same halachah applies. Since the sicha, since the dibur was l'tzarech tefillin, it does not constitute a hefsek, and you don't have to make a new bracha. So the Mishnah Berurah is medayik over here in the Mechaber. The Mechaber said, im sach, if you spoke l'tzarech tefillin, einer chayzer u'mavarech. Now that's a lashon of b'di'evet. If you spoke, you don't have to go ahead and repeat the bracha. Points out the Mishnah Berurah, aval lechatchila, asar lahasiach bein birkas lahaniach ad achar hanocha shel rosh afilu b'dvarim shein l'tzarech tefillin. Lechatchila, you should not speak from the time that you make the bracha of lahaniach tefillin until after you put on the Shel Rosh, both according to the Mechaber and according to the Ramah. Lechatchila, even l'tzarech tefillin, you shouldn't speak. If you have to, if you have to motion with your hand or something, better do that. But don't be mafsik b'dibur, even if it's l'tzarech tefillin. Unless there simply is no other choice, you have no choice but to speak. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, b'chalamayid she'ein mevarchen, on chalamayid, when people who put on tefillin and chalamayid put on tefillin without a bracha, or let's say people are putting on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, where you put on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin without a bracha, efshir diyesh lahakeh lechatchila b'dvarim she'em l'tzarech tefillin. In that case, maybe the Mishnah Berurah says you could be mekel, and you could speak between the putting on of the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh if you are doing it l'tzarech tefillin. So again, what's the halachah that we see over here so far from the Mechaber over here in Sif Yud? You're not allowed to be mafsik between the putting on of the Shel Yad and the putting on of the Shel Rosh. The Mechaber said, b'di eved, if you talked in between putting on the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, but you spoke l'tzoyrach mitzvahs tefillin, you spoke for something that was negeya to the mitzvah of tefillin, then the Mechaber said you don't have to go ahead and repeat any brachas. The Mishnah Berurah points out that's only b'di eved. Lechatchila, even l'tzarech mitzvahs tefillin, you should take care not to speak. He says there's an exception on chalamoid or Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. When you're putting on tefillin without a bracha, we learned yesterday that really, even then you're not supposed to be mafsik between putting on the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. But over here, the Mishnah Berurah says, if you want to be mafsik b'dibur l'tzarech mitzvahs tefillin, then maybe even lechatchila you can do so. Now let's go right to here in the Shulchan Aruch, middle of the line, top line, Lamed Aleph, Lamed Aleph. Im shama kaddish oy kedusha. This is something that comes up a lot. Im shama kaddish oy kedusha. If you're in shul and you're in the middle of putting on your tefillin, and they start saying a kaddish oy kedusha, or maybe there's another minyan going on. You're putting on your tefillin, and they get up to kedusha. You hear kedusha. Bein tefillah shel yad l'tefillah shel rosh. You're in the middle of putting on your tefillin. You just put on your Shel Yad. You didn't put on your Shel Rosh yet. And suddenly the Chazan is saying Kaddish and he's up to Amen Yehesh Be'Rabba. Says the Mechaber, Lo yafsik la nois imahem. You should not be mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh and answer Kaddish or answer Kedusha. Ella, instead, what should you do? Shoisek, you should stay silent. V'shoimeya, and you should listen. U'mechaven lamasha oimrim, and you should pay attention and have in mind what they are saying. So you put on your Shel Yad, you're about to put on your Shel Rosh, you hear Kaddish get up to Yehesh Rabbah, be quiet and listen carefully to Yehesh Rabbah Mevarach La'olam La'ol Me'al Maya, and have in mind the meaning of the words. And by doing so, that's like Shemea Ka'oina. It's as if that you yourself said Yehi Shmei Rabbah. Now the Mishnah Berurah will point out it's Shemea Ka'oina to the extent that you're Mekayim your Chiyuv to answer Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbah. But it's not Shemea Ka'oina to the extent that we look at it as if you are mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah over here. Ois Katan Lamed Hey Lo Yafsik. If you hear the Shlach Tzibur say Kaddish or Kedusha, you should not be mafsik. Va'afilu la'anois amein al bracha zu gufa. Even to answer amein on this very bracha. What does that mean? You made a bracha to put on tefillin. You said Asher Kedushanim b'mitzvayis avesivanu lahanyach tefillin. Now you're putting on your Shel Yad, and the fellow next to you is also putting on his tefillin, and you hear him make the bracha lahanyach tefillin. You might think that that doesn't really constitute a hefsek. What am I saying amen to? I'm saying amen to the very bracha of the mitzvah that I'm in the middle of. Maybe that does not constitute a hefsek. The Mishnah Berurah says it does. Even to answer amen on the very bracha of lahanyach tefillin, you're not allowed to do between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. Also, it's forbidden. Unless what's going on is that fellow is being moitzi you in the bracha of lahanyach tefillin. For some reason you can't make the bracha, maybe you don't know how, so he's being moitzi you, then certainly you could say amen. That doesn't constitute a hefsek. Brings this down from the Chuvas Tvar Shmuel, V'agoyin Rabbi Kiva Eger b'chidushav t'loy kapanim irei sayin sham. Ais kod lamed vav. The Mechaber said you should not be mafsik la'anois imahem. You should not be mafsik to answer to kedusha or to answer to kaddish with the tzibur. Now, what do you do if you goofed? What do you do if you are in the middle of putting on your tefillin and you heard kaddish and you forgot this halachah and you answered Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbah between putting on the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh? Says the Mishnah Berurah Kat Lamed Vav, V'im pasak va'ana Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbah oy kedusha oy baruchu. If you were mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh by answering Yehi Shmei Rabbah or by answering to kedusha or baruchu, oy sha'ana Amen al eza bracha sheshama, or you answered amen to some bracha that you heard. Maybe you heard, maybe the tzibur is in the middle of Chazaras Hashatz, and you heard a bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Mevarach Hashanim, and you went ahead and you said amen. What do? Paskins de Mishnah Berurah Chayzer u'Mevarech. You should go ahead and you have to make the bracha over again. So practically speaking, what does that mean? You made Asher Kedushanim b'mitzvayis avesivanu lahanyach tefillin. You're putting on your Shel Yad. Now you answered Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbah Mevarach La'olam U'Maya. Now you want to go put on your Shel Rosh. According to us, we pass it like the Ramah. You have to make a new lahanyach tefillin when you go now to put on the Shel Rosh. You have to make two brachas. You have to say lahanyach tefillin and al mitzvahs tefillin when you put on the Shel Rosh. And we learned yesterday that you should be memashmesh in the Shel Yad when you do this. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter, Va'ayin bir halacha. He sends us to the bir halacha, where the bir halacha just points out in the very beginning of the bir halacha here exactly what I just said. If you look at the bir halacha, Dibra Maschil Mishama Kaddish, the second line of the bir halacha, he says Va'ayin b'chai adam shekasav b'pshitos. Take a look at the Chai Adam who writes, and it's very simple, that according to us, we pass it like the Ramah, Tzarech Levarach Shtayim, you would have to make now two brachas before you put on the Shel Rosh, Al Shel Rosh. Ola Mechaber lo Yevarach Kiyam Al Mitzvahs. According to the Mechaber, you would only have to make a bracha of Al Mitzvahs before you put on the Shel Rosh. Continues the Mishnah Berurah over here, nice cut Lamed Vav. Ubechal HaMoyed, on Chol HaMoyed, where you're putting on tefillin without a bracha, or people who put on tefillin shel Rabbeinu Tam. So again, you're putting on tefillin without a bracha. Shemaniach bali bracha. In that case, yesh lahakel. Then you could be makel, says the Mishnah Berurah. Or lahafsik la'anias amen yehi shmei Rabbah ukedusha ubaruchu va'amen. Very interesting, very negeya to those people like myself who put on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. You're putting on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, and you hear Kaddish or Kedusha or Baruch Hu between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, Paskins the Mishnah Berurah, you could be makel. Because let's remember, when you're putting on tefillin without a bracha, like Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, the reason you're not allowed to be mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, we learned yesterday in the Mishnah Berurah, is because we learn out from the pasuk that the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh are always supposed to be tekuf v'samach, tekuf v'smuchin, zeh lo zeh. They have to come one right after the other because of the pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'hayula taitafais beinei necha." They should be havaya achas likulam. It has to be done at the same time. But over there's no shaila of a hefsek between the brachas. You're not making a bracha, so there's no shaila of hefsek between the brachas. So for this inyan alone of havaya achas, over there the Mishnah Berurah says you could be makel when it comes to Yesh Be'Rabba, Kedusha, Baruch Hu, Amen to a bracha, and you could be mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. Achar kach yozis ha-Shel Yad b'mekaymai kaidem sheyaniach ha-Shel Rosh. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, if you are mafsik, you should move the Shel Yad off of its place before you put on the Shel Rosh, and then put the Shel Yad back, and then put on the Shel Rosh, kedei sheyiyah havaya achas lishnehen, so that there should be this inyan of the two of them happening at the same time, havaya achas lishnehen. I have a very interesting question, very interesting shaila that I'm trying to find out the answer to, but so far it's been a little bit elusive to find out the answer. I put on my tefillin according to the minimze of Rav Moshe Zechet Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha, who showed me how to put on tefillin on the day that I put on tefillin. I make the bracha on the Shel Yad, I put on the Shel Yad, and we're going to learn about this very shortly, and I do only 3 turns around my arm, and then 3 around the finger, then I put on my Shel Rosh, then I take off the 3 turns that I did on my finger and on my arm, and then I do 7. In the normal way. Why? For this inyan to be memayit the hefsek between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. My question is, I also put on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. Should I do that by Rabbeinu Tam tefillin as well? Or by Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, when I put on the Shel Yad, should I do all 7? Now, all my life when I've been putting on, I haven't been putting on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin my whole life. I started after I got married. For a specific reason, I started putting on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. But since I started to put on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, I always did all 7 krichos of the Shel Yad before I put on the Shel Rosh. The reason is because of the Mishnah Berurah that we learned today. We learned today in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed Daled that on Chol Hamoed, when you don't make a bracha on the tefillin, and presumably as well Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, when you don't make a bracha on the tefillin, the Mishnah Berurah said you could be mafsik even lichatchila between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh if you're doing so l'tzorich tefillin. Now this is certainly l'tzorich tefillin. So I always felt that I should do all 7 krichos on the arm by the Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. Now when I'm learning this again, I'm wondering about it. So I'm trying to find somebody who actually witnessed Rav Moshe put on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, so I could ask how Rav Moshe did it. Believe it or not, I asked my Rebbe, Yibadal L'chaim, Reb Ruvain, Zechet Tzadik V'Kadosh, I asked Reb Ruvain, Zol Zayin Gesund und Stark, and Reb Ruvain told me he never once in his life saw his father put on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. So he doesn't know. So I have to get hold of somebody who witnessed him putting on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, and I have to ask. Okay, now we go to Mishnah Berurah's Katan Lamed Zayin. So the Mechaber said, if you hear Kaddish or Kedusha or Baruch Hu, Amen Yesh Be'Rabba, you should not be mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. Rather, the Mechaber said you should be shoisek, you should be silent, v'shomeya, and you should listen, u'mechavein, and you should have kavanah for what the tzibur is saying. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the hashtika ka'aniyah, because the shtika, being quiet and listening to what the tzibur is saying, is ka'aniyah. It's like saying the words that the tzibur is saying. Let's say Amen Yesh Be'Rabba, le'inyan lotzeis yedei choiva, in the context of the chiyuv that you have to say Amen Yesh Be'Rabba. Avaloi sheyichashev kavsaka, but not that it constitutes a hefsek. It's a very interesting, we're splitting hairs in halachah over here. What we're saying is, you're holding in the middle of putting on tefillin. You put on your Shel Yad. You didn't put on your Shel Rosh. You hear Amen Yehei Shmei Rabbah. And what does the Mechaber say? The Mechaber says, okay, be silent and listen to Amen Yehei Shmei Rabbah and have kavanah. So what are you accomplishing? You're accomplishing Shemei Koina. You're listening and having kavanah Yehei Shmei Rabbah. It's as if you said Yehei Shmei Rabbah. If it's as if you said Yehei Shmei Rabbah, why doesn't it constitute a hefsek between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh? So says the Chavetz Chaim, no, we split hairs. It's Shemei Koina. It's Shemei Koina to the extent. It's Shemei Koina to the extent that your Yoitza, whatever chiyuv you have to say Amen Yehei Shmei Rabbah, but it's not Shemei Koina to the extent that it should constitute a hefsek between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. Okay. Now we go weiter in the Mechaber Sif Yud Aleph. And now we're going to speak to what I just told you, my minig, the minig that I follow, the minig of Rav Moshe Zechet Tzadik V'Kadosh L'Vracha of how to put on the Shel Yad. Says the Mechaber, Achar shekashar Shel Yad al Hazraya, after you actually tie the Shel Yad onto your arm. So you positioned the Shel Yad in the proper place, you made the bracha of Laniach Tefillin, and now you tightened the Shel Yad. So the Shel Yad is now tightened onto your arm. You have now been mekayim the mitzvah of putting on the Shel Yad. So again, let's just address Mechaber land and Ramah land. Both according to the Mechaber and according to the Ramah, the bracha of Laniach Tefillin has to cover both the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. According to the Mechaber, that's the only bracha you're going to make, as long as you're not mafsek. You made a Laniach, it's covering the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, and you're done. According to the Ramah, you made a Laniach, it covers the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, but you still have to make a bracha of al mitzvahs before you put on the Shel Rosh. But in either case, the bracha that you just made has to cover both the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. Now, after you tie the Shel Yad onto your arm, you really have done everything that is halachically required, strict requirements. You have already fulfilled all of the strict requirements of the Shel Yad. The Shel Yad is tied onto your arm. Anything else that you do now is somewhat extraneous. Now, of course, to be mekayim the mitzvah of the Shel Yad l'chatchila, you have to do the turns around your arm, you have to do the turns around your finger and around your hand, but none of that is required midaraisa. To fulfill the requirement midaraisa of ukishartem la'os al yodecha, you did that already. You tied it onto your arm. Now, if we want to be memayit the hefsek between the Shel Yad and Shel Rosh as much as possible, so tie it onto your arm, and then right away go to the Shel Rosh. What are we wasting time and doing other things in between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh? And that's exactly what the Mechaber addresses over here in Sif Yud Aleph. Says the Mechaber, Achar shekasher Shel Yad al Hazraya, after you complete tying the Tefillah Shel Yad onto your arm, Yaniach Shel Rosh, put on the Shel Rosh, Kaidem sheyikroi charitzua savev Hazraya, before you go and make the twists of the ritzuas around your arm, because that's unnecessary. We don't really need that. That's what the Mechaber says. Says the Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Lamed Ches. Kaidem sheyikroich hatam. What's the rationale for this? Kevan sheberkas lahaniach. Since the bracha of lahaniach tefillin chayzeres gam al Shel Rosh covers the Shel Rosh as well. Kenira la'el, like we saw earlier, besif Katan Lamed Aleph. The Cholshkein certainly lahamechaber le'el b'sif hey. Certainly, according to Svardim, according to the Mechaber, the Sfira le'deinim of arach alachas kama v'kama. According to the Mechaber, you only make one bracha. So the Laniach covers the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. But even according to even according to the Ramah, the bracha of Laniach goes on the Shel Rosh also. So al kain, therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, Yemayit ha'hefsek b'chol ma sheyuchal. We have to make the hefsek between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh as small as humanly possible. V'hakricha savev Hazraya, and the wrapping of the ritzua around the arm, eina me'ikar adin. It's not necessary me'ikar adin. Al kain, therefore, toiv la'acharoisa, it's better to delay it ad she'aniach Shel Rosh, until you put on the Shel Rosh. Ubesefer Kavanos Ha'ari Zechrayna Levracha, in the Sefer Kavanos of the Ari, he writes, Shahayanoyeg Likrei Chashiva Krichei Saviv Zraya Tchila. The minig of the Ari was to do the 7 krichas around the arm before the Shel Rosh, Avaloya Shalish Krichei Shala Etzpa, but not the 3 twists around the finger. Mipnei Shehu Soiver Kevin Delechatchila Gama Krichais Hu Mitzvah, because the Ari said, the bottom line is, those 7 turns that you do around your arm, it's also part of the mitzvah. So you're right. It's not necessary, me'ikar adin, but it is a lechatchila part of the mitzvah, right? That's the proper way to put on tefillin. So, therefore, says the Ari, it does not constitute a hefsek. V'cheina minig b'kama mekaymais, and the Mishnah Berurah brings this down from the Pri Megadim. V'cheina minig b'kama mekaymais, that is the minig in many places. V'ayin b'tshuvas Mishkanis Yaakov Sibin Chav Ches, daitay gam kein kimin hageinu. Over here the Chavetz Chaim says that the Mishkanis Yaakov also did like our minig, so now he's calling it our minig. Likroich kaidem ala zraya al chizuk, to do the turns around the arm, because that also helps hold the tefillah Shel Yad in place. The balavach iloi miskayim. Because he says, if you don't do the turns around the arm, what's going to hold the Shel Yad in place? And then it wouldn't be considered a kashira. And the truth is, I think if you think about this practically speaking, what exactly holds the tefillin Shel Yad in place on the arm? You take it, you tighten it. All it is a ritzua through a loop, right? So if you would let go right now, it would certainly fall off. So what holds it in place? You tighten it, and then you do the wraps around your arm. Now, because it's also wrapped around your arm, this can't loosen up. So that's the svar of the Mishkanis Yaakov. The Mishkanis Yaakov is saying, I don't understand. How could you call this a hefsek? Without this isn't going to stay in place. Now, theoretically, I guess, according to the Mechaber, what you could do is, you could tighten it in place, maybe make one twist, and then hold the ritzua tight with your hand. L'chayra, that would keep this tight while you put on the Shel Rosh. I have to try it and mess around with it and see how well it works. But in any case, what do we have so far? We have a Mechaber. The Mechaber says, just tighten it and then go right away to put on the Shel Rosh. Don't do the twists around the arm. We have the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah brings down from the Ari that the Ari said, no, do all 7 krichas around the arm, because that's part of the mitzvah, and therefore it does not constitute a hefsek. Brings down from the Mishkanis Yaakov over here another reason why you should do it, because that helps keep the kshira tight, and it helps keep the Shel Yad in place, and without that, maybe it's not even called a kshira. Okay. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Kasav b'sefer Marma Mordechai, im shama kaddish ukedusha achar shebirich al Shel Yad. Right? We just spoke before that you're not allowed to be mafsik between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, not even to answer to kaddish, not even to answer Amen Yesh Be'Rabba or to kedusha. So now, get a load of this shaila. Mishnah Berurah brings down from the Marma Mordechai. Let's say you started putting on tefillin, and now suddenly they just said, and they're going to start saying Kaddish Yosem. And you're going to have to answer Amen Yesh Be'Rabba. But you're going to be in the middle of putting on the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. Oh, so now you have a good idea. Wait a second. I could do it fast. Instead of doing the 7 turns around the arm, I'll just tighten the kshira on the yad and right away put on the Shel Rosh, and I'll finish in time to say Amen Yesh Be'Rabba. Oh, says the Mishnah Berurah, if you heard Kaddish or Kedusha after you made the Loniach Tefillin on the Shel Yad, and if you're going to do the turns around your arm, it's going to be too late. You're not going to have time to put on the Shel Rosh and answer Amen Yesh Be'Rabba. Then certainly you should put on the Shel Rosh before you do the twists around the arm. As long as you can tighten the Shel Yad enough, so that it should not move off of its place. So this certainly we see we see very clearly that those twists around the arm are not ma'akiv, they're not critical, and therefore we have this whole discussion over here whether or not you should do them before you put on the Shel Rosh. Again, I only do 3 because that was the minig of Rav Moshe. I do 3. Interestingly enough, and this is another thing I have to be mevarer, we see over here in the Ari did all 7. But the Mishnah Berurah says even though the Ari did all 7, he didn't do any on his finger. So he did all 7 and none on the hand or the fingers, which I think is the most prevalent minig that I've seen. I don't do all 7. I do only 3 on the arm, but I do 3 on my finger. Because that's what I remember Rav Moshe showed me. I remember that Rav Moshe showed me to do 3 on the finger. Reb Ruvain does not do 3 on the finger. Reb Ruvain does 3 on the arm, but not 3 on the finger. And Reb Ruvain told me he has heard from many people like me that his father said to do the 3 on the finger, but he says he never heard that from his father. And he doesn't see a source for it in halachah. And therefore, Reb Ruvain says, according to Hilchos HaPsak, since he never received a psak from his father to put the 3 on the finger, even though it's come to him that his father did hold that way, but since he never received that psak from his father, and he cannot find a source for it in halacha, therefore he doesn't do it. So I do it one way, but Reb Ruvain does it another way. But all right, that's the way it is. Okay. Okay. Now we go weiter. Let's go back to the Shulchan Aruch, 3 lines off the bottom. We continue with the words of the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said so far, well, it's not really a continuation, so we could just go weiter. Nu halacha, says the Mechaber, 3 lines from the bottom near the beginning of the line. V'yesh mi she'omer. Just a little hakdama to this. Let's remember, we've discussed already several times, including yesterday, ein mavirin al hamitzvahs, right? You take the tefillin before the talis, you're going to have to put on the tefillin because you can't be mavar al mitzvahs. Once you have access to the tefillin, you can't pass by the tefillin and put on the talis instead. So you got to put on your tefillin before you put on the talis. Yet, we learned, if you take the Shel Rosh first before the Shel Yad, then you have no choice. You have to be mavar al mitzvahs. You have to put the Shel Rosh down, and you have to take the Shel Yad and put on the Shel Yad. Because the fact that the Shel Yad has to be put on before the Shel Rosh comes from a pasuk. So we can't go against the dictates of the pasuk because of Ein Mavir and Ala Mitzvahs. Now we're going to address Ein Mavir and Ala Mitzvahs again. Says the Mechaber, V'yesh mi she'omer, there are those that say, and he brings this down from a Tshuvas Hari Giktila. Okay. V'yesh mi she'omer, she'oser lohoitzi tefillah shel rosh mehatik. You're not allowed to remove the tefillah shel rosh from the bag ad shetehei tefillah shel yad munachas, until the tefillah shel yad is already on. So let's put this in perspective for a minute and try to figure out what the Mechaber is telling me. The Mechaber told me already previously in Sivav that if you take hold of the Shel Rosh before the Shel Yad, you have a problem. You have to put the Shel Rosh down and then put on the Shel Yad. Now, even though that's a problem, you're being mavar al mitzvahs, you have no choice. You have to be mavar al mitzvahs in that case. But we already know from the Mechaber in Sivav that you are not supposed to take hold of the Shel Rosh before you take hold of the Shel Yad. Now over here in Sif Yad Aleph, the Mechaber is bringing down a yesh mi she'omer that you should not take the tefillin Shel Rosh out of the bag until the tefillin Shel Yad is already properly in place on your arm. Now, what's the chiddush, Mechaber? You already told me that I shouldn't take hold of the Shel Rosh before I put on the Shel Yad. So first of all, what's the chiddush that you're telling me here? And second of all, how come over here you're only saying it's a yesh mi she'omer? In Sivav, you told me it's a halacha psuka. Now you're telling me it's a yesh mishomer. So obviously the Mechaber is addressing a slightly different case here. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat and Lamed Tes. The Mishnah Berurah says she'aser hainu. What the Mechaber is telling me over here is afilu im yirtze lahoitzi Shel Rosh Shel Yad. Even if what you're doing is you're taking out the Shel Rosh and the Shel Yad, shneihen b'shaveh min atik. You're taking them both out of the bag at the same time. De bazeh ein maver ala mitzvahs. So in this case, there is no problem of maver ala mitzvahs. Now let's stop here for a second to figure out what the Mishnah Berurah is telling me. The Mishnah Berurah is explaining. In Siv Vav, the Mechaber already addressed ein mavir ala mitzvahs, and in Siv Vav, the Mechaber already told me the halachah that I'm not allowed to take the Shel Rosh before the Shel Yad, and if I did take the Shel Rosh before the Shel Yad, I got a problem. I got to put it down and then take the Shel Yad and put it on. That's ein mavir and ala mitzvahs. Over here, the Mechaber is telling me a new halachah that has nothing to do with ein mavir and ala mitzvahs. Why? Because over here, the Mechaber is telling me like this. Let's say I come to shul and I want to put on my tefillin. I put on my talis already. Now it's time to put on my tefillin. Now, most people, right, how do they put on their tefillin? They take out their tefillin bag. The Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh are both, camera's out of focus, hello. The Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh are both in the tefillin bag. So what this person wants to do is, right, they're both in the tefillin bag. What most people do is they put in their hand, take out the Shel Yad, they open it up, they make the bracha, they put on the Shel Yad. Then after they finish putting on the Shel Yad, they go back into the tefillin bag, take out the Shel Rosh. This guy is a more Masudr Dika person. What he wants to do is, he wants to put on his Shel Yad and his Shel Rosh, and we just learned that you're supposed to be memayit the hefsek between the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh as much as possible. So this fellow says, I have a great idea. Instead of leaving both tefillin in the bag, and now after I put on the Shel Yad, I have to reach into the bag and take out the Shel Rosh. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take out both of them first, put them down on top of the bag. So now, instead of them being in the bag, they're both in front of me, outside of the bag. So what does he do? He puts either both his hands or one hand into the bag. He grabs hold of both the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh. He takes them out of the bag, and he puts both of them down on the table in front of him. Now he wants to put on the Shel Yad. So he goes and he picks up the Shel Yad to put on the Shel Yad. Is there an ein mavir and ala mitzvahs problem here? No. At what point was there an ein mavir and ala mitzvahs problem? You might be tempted to tell me, well, he was holding the Shel Rosh in his hand when he took them out of the bag and he put it down. Maybe that's being maver ala mitzvahs on the Shel Rosh. No. Because when he took them out of the bag, he had both of them in his hands. He went in and he took out the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh both at the same time. And he's not ready to put them on yet. First, he's putting them both down. This is the kaidem l'kaidem. This is the step before being ready to put the tefillin on. I took both out of the bag and I put them both down in front of me and I let go of both. Now I'm ready to pick up one and put it on. So I'll pick up the Shel Yad. So there's no ein mavir and ala mitzvahs here. That's what the Mechaber means. The Mechaber means v'yesh mi she'omer she'asa lahitzi tefillah Shel Rosh me'atek ad she tefillah Shel Yad munachas. There are those that say do not remove the Shel Rosh from the bag, even in the scenario that I just described, where there's no problem of ein mavir and ala mitzvahs. Still do not do that. Why? Because we don't want the tefillah Shel Rosh out of the bag until the tefillah Shel Yad is properly in its place. Why not? So let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says. The Mishnah Berurah says, again, I'm going to read from the beginning of Ois Kat and Lamed Tes. Hainu, afilu im yirtze lahoitzi Shel Rosh Shel Yad shtein b'shaveh min atik. Even in a scenario where you're going to take the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh both out of the bag at the same time, and then you're going to put both of them down in front of you. De bazeh ein maver ala mitzvahs, where in this case there is no problem of ein mavir and ala mitzvahs. Afilu hachi, still yesh li zoher. you should still not do this. You should be careful not to do this. Why? Beyond our pay grade. Because al pi Kabbalah, there's a reason that the tefillah Shel Rosh should stay in the bag until the tefillah Shel Yad is properly in place. Okay. V'chol shekain, certainly, says the Chafetz Chaim, lahaniach Shel Yad miyadai, certainly, you want to stick your hand into the bag, take out the Shel Yad, and then put down the Shel Yad, and then go back into the bag and take out the Shel Rosh. That's certainly a problem. V'chol shekain lahaniach Shel Yad miyadai, to put down the Shel Yad, ulehisasek ba'itzas Shel Rosh, and then to go take the Shel Rosh out of the bag, Midina Aser. That would be Aser al Pidin, because that would be Ein Mavirin ala Mitzvahs. So you see how careful you have to be to learn this. It's so detailed. The fine details over here. You had one halach in Sivav, that's Ein Mavirin ala Mitzvahs. You have another halach here in Sif Yalav, this is not Ein Mavirin ala Mitzvahs. This is Divrei Kabbalah. That's what this is. Because the Mechaber over here is addressing a scenario where there is no problem of Ein Mavirin al HaMitzvahs. Ais Kat Mem, you should not take the Shel Rosh out of the bag until the Shel Yad is munachas, until it's properly in place. Ritzoynoi loymar, what does that mean, munachas? Shetia muhudekes yafa al azraya, until the Shel Yad is tightened properly in place on the arm. Va'oz, and then mutter, then you can take out the Shel Rosh. Even before you did the 7 turns. We saw some people don't even make the 7 turns. Interesting shaila. What if you're a Rebbe and you have a shamish? So you took out your Shel Yad and you're busy putting on your Shel Yad. In the meantime, the Gabbai wants to take out the Shel Rosh and get the Shel Rosh ready for you, so that you could immediately take the Shel Rosh and put on the Shel Rosh. We just said that al pi Kabbalah, the Shel Rosh is supposed to stay in the bag. So now the Chafetz Chaim is wondering. He's wondering, V'im acha yochel lahitzi l'saken Shel Rosh ba'ich chaver minir Shel Yad. Is it an Indian that you should not take out the Shel Rosh from the bag until the Shel Yad is properly in place, but somebody else could do it for you? Or maybe no, it's supposed to stay there until you put on the Shel Yad. Okay, now we're going to see the Ramah. Wow, I thought we were going to get further today. I thought we were going to do half of Lamadal on the base. Now we're going to see the Ramah. I would be tempted to stop here, Rabbi Isai, but I can't, because we're continuing the same inyan, and there's going to be a cute little chap over here, and I take issue with one of the Dirshu footnotes. Says the Ramah, Hago. Va'af im shneim lefanav chutz latik. Even if you have a scenario where both the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh are already out of the bag. So, yeah, we said you're supposed to leave both of them in the bag. Let's say last night you were teaching your bar mitzvah bacher how to put on tefillin. And when you finished, you wrapped up your tefillin, but you didn't put them back in the bag. You left them out on top of the tefillin bartel. And now it's the morning and you're coming to put on tefillin. And guess what? They're both out of the bag. So now there's no shaila of how you're going to take it out. You're not going to put it back in the bag first, right? So they're both laying in front of you now. Says the Ramah, Va'afim shteim lefanav chutz latik, lo yisaken liftayach hatfil shel Rosh. You should not get busy opening up the Shel Rosh. You know, taking the ritzuas off the case, taking it out of the case. Don't open up the Shel Rosh ad achar hanacha Shel Yad, until after you put on the Shel Yad. Okay, what does this mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah, lo yisaken, ois kat mem aleph, ritzayin loymar. What the Ramah wants to say is like this. Again, let's analyze this Ramah. What is he talking about? You have the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh sitting in front of you out on the table. What's the Ramah telling me I shouldn't do? He's not telling me that before I put on the Shel Yad, I shouldn't pick up the Shel Rosh and open up the Shel Rosh. That you're sicher not allowed to do. That's bona fide Mavirin ala Mitzvahs. You're picking up the Shel Rosh, and now you're going to have to put the Shel Rosh down and pick up the Shel Yad. That's Mamish Ein Mavirin ala Mitzvahs. Right? So I don't need the Ramah to tell me that I can't do that. And yet, that's exactly what it sounds like the Ramah is saying. Both of them are laying in front of you on the table. Lo yisakin l'ftayach atfila Shel Rosh. You shouldn't open up the Shel Rosh ad achar hanocha Shel Yad until after you put on the Shel Yad. I don't need the Ramah to tell me that. So explains the Ramah, Ritzaynai loymar. Again, there's a problem here. So says the Ramah, you know what the Ramah is telling you? I'll tell you what he means to tell you. Ritzaynai loymar. What the Ramah wants to say is, afilu im be'ez tikun hashel rosh. Even if the scenario is that while you're opening up the Shel Rosh, lo yaniach hashel yad gam kein miyadoi, you're still going to be holding the Shel Yad in your hand. So it's a mud in the case. Somehow, let's say you went ahead and you picked up the Shel Yad and you opened up the Shel Yad. And now you're holding the Shel Yad and you decide that before you put the Shel Yad on, you want to open up the Shel Rosh. So you continue holding the Shel Yad, you pick up the Shel Rosh, now you're holding both of them, and you open up the Shel Rosh. And now you're not going to put the Shel Rosh down. You're going to take the Shel Yad, you're going to put the Shel Yad on while you're holding the Shel Rosh. You're going to put on the Shel Yad, and then you'll take the Shel Rosh and you'll put on the Shel Rosh. Even in that scenario, says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu in be'ez hatikun hashel rosh. Even if while you're opening up the Shel Rosh, lo yaniach hashel yad gam kein miyado, you never put the Shel Yad down. Afilu hachi kishemeniach achar kach Shel Rosh. Oh no, the scenario is different than what I said. I'm sorry. You were holding the Shel Yad, you picked up the Shel Rosh, you opened up the Shel Rosh. But now you're going to put the Shel Rosh down. Afilu hachi kishemeniach achar kach Shel Rosh lo haniach hashel yad. But when you put the Shel Rosh down, heavy kamaver ala mitzvahs. Now it's like you're being maver ala mitzvahs. This is maver ala mitzvahs. Why? Because you took the Shel Rosh and you put the Shel Rosh down. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the very fact that you were holding the Shel Rosh and you put the Shel Rosh down, that constitutes, without putting it on, that constitutes being maver ala mitzvahs. Now, the Dirshu footnote number 47 has a problem with this. Dirshu footnote number 47 says, I don't understand. Over here, in Ois Cotton Mem Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah says that this constitutes ein mavir ala mitzvahs. Why? Because you were holding the Shel Rosh and you put it down. And that's ein mavir ala mitzvahs. Yet, the Mishnah Berurah said earlier, in Lamid Tes, the Mishnah Berurah said, if you took the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh out of the bag, right, and then you put them both down on the table, that's not ein mavir ala mitzvahs. Why? The Dirshu footnote says, I don't understand. You are holding the Shel Rosh and you put it down on the table. I don't understand the Dirshu's question at all. It's very simple. It's the way I explain it to you. In Ois Cotton Lamid Tes, there's no ein mavir ala mitzvahs. Because that's the step before when you were ready to put the tefillin on. That was you were preparing to put the tefillin on. You took the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh both out of the bag at the same time, and you put both of them down. And now you go and you pick up the Shel Yad to go put on the Shel Yad. That's not ein mavir ala mitzvahs. Over here, what you did is you took the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh, you opened up the Shel Rosh, and then you put down the Shel Rosh. But you were already holding it in your hand when you're ready to put the tefillin on. So why did you put on the Shel Yad before the Shel Rosh? That's already ein mavir al hamitzvahs. Okay. I guess we're going to have to stop over here, and we'll have to continue with Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Mem Aleph tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Schus of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should say Yeshua for his parnasa and Shidduchim to all those in need. And we should be zeicher to see the BSK Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.